Good morning. I suspect that's going to catch most of our audience. For anybody else that may be joining us potentially from Europe or any place else across the globe, good afternoon, good evening, whatever the case may be for you. My name is Robert Mullen. I'm going to be your moderator today for this live webinar. Thanks for joining us. This is our first attempt with this format. This is going to be a live panel discussion with the Nutrien Wholesale Agronomy team. If things go well, if you have an audience find value in this, we may be doing more of these. So please, if you enjoy this interaction, provide us that feedback. That'll inform us what our direction will be going forward. Let me start by introducing the team that we're going to be speaking with today. These are the colleagues that I work with on a day-to-day basis. They're all very well respected within the realm of nutrient management. I think you're going to enjoy this interaction that we're going to have with each other. Our role on the agronomy team within Nutrien is primarily technical support for our sales professionals and our customers. We also have responsibilities for product testing. We coordinate research within our respective geographies. That goes for some of the premium products that we offer as a company. That's going to be the MST, the ESN, the Rainbow products. We all have a pretty good background, both practically as agronomists and scientifically as researchers. Some of us consider ourselves fairly overeducated. That'll probably come out in the conversation today. First, we're going to start with Dr. Alan Blaylock. He's going to be joining us from Colorado. Alan has worked extensively across North America as well as internationally in his career, and he brings a treasure trove of information to the team just from his knowledge and experience. We also have Dr. Cristie Preston. She resides in eastern Kansas. Cristie has experience in crop production systems primarily on the East Coast and the Central Plains, as well as having a background in fertilizer technology. And last, but certainly not least, we have Mike Howell. Mike has over 20 years of experience conducting applied research and delivering outreach education programs in the Southeast United States. So as you can see from the team, we have a pretty good geographic representation. That's going to inform some of the responses that are provided to the questions that were submitted. To that point, I want to thank everyone who did submit a question as a part of that registration process. We hope that wasn't too onerous in your registration, but that was important to us to make sure that we get a feel for what you're looking for from us with regard to educational content. That certainly informs how we prepared for today. There's a lot of questions that we had to sift through. We're going to answer as many as we can as time does permit us. We're going to allocate about an hour for today. We'll start with the questions that were submitted online during the registration process. As we proceed through, if you'd like to submit a question, please use the Q&A tab what you see at the bottom of the screen. Click on that, submit the question. We can't promise that we'll get to all of those today, just it's going to be dictated by what our time allotment allows. But we'll certainly, if there is time at the end, we'll certainly do our best to address those. Again, thank you again for joining us, and we're going to go ahead and get started. The first question that we have, this is going to be for Mike. Just for you as an audience member, as you're sort of following along, we're going to start with one individual providing an answer, but we're certainly going to open up to the rest of the panel if they maybe have a little bit of a different perspective, which is most likely going to be informed by their geography and the crops that they're talking about. But the first question is, how should I respond to in-season tissue results in corn? And Mike, we're going to let you have the first stab at that.
Hi, thank you, Robert. As a matter of fact, that's a very pertinent topic right now. A lot of these crops are mid-season or getting closer to maturity. And we actually did a webinar on that a couple of weeks ago, and you can find that on our eKonomics website. It's posted online there, so you can see how to properly take tissue samples. And Dr. Bobby Golden with Mississippi State went through that and talked about how to interpret the results and what to do with those results. But to answer the question, for micronutrients, if we're in the low or moderate category, we think we may need to supply some micronutrients. You should consider applying a foliar product to supply the needs of the crop in season. A lot of times for these micronutrients, we can get the product out there in a foliar application to get us through the season. If we're talking about a macronutrient deficiency, it gets a little more complicated. Usually the foliar products don't provide enough of the nutrient to make a difference during the growing season. We need to put a granular product out there, and it's going to have time to get into the soil solution and be taken up by the plant. You also have an issue with how are you going to apply that during the growing season and get that product on the field. A lot of times in the Southeast, we'll do that by air. We'll call in an airplane and put out a application that way. That's just going to add to the expense. So you to determine for yourself if that's going to be an economical benefit to doing that. And calling in the cost of the airplane, and it gets pretty expensive to do that. In severe situations, you probably will have to do that. I think the main thing to remember is nutrient deficiencies. We need to think prevention. We need to address those before the growing season starts. We need to make sure we take a soil sample, follow those recommendations, get out in the field what we need out there before the crops get started. It's a lot easier to address it pre-season than during the middle of the season.
Great answer. Does anybody else want to follow up on what Mike has shared?
Sure. Add a little bit to that. I like to think about tissue testing in a somewhat similar way to what I think about foliar applications. And I think about preventive strategies versus corrective strategies. If this tissue sample is part of a preventative program, I'm going to be doing like Mike says. I want to make sure that I do the best job I can with my soil applications pre-plant, and then that tissue sampling is probably going to be taken regularly over some period of time, maybe every couple of weeks or something like that. So I'm monitoring the crop. If it's a corrective situation, I'm trying to diagnose some symptom that I've seen in the field, then I might be treating that a little differently in that I want to sample good areas against bad areas and make that comparison so I can see what differences might be there. So I kind of separate it into those two basic strategies, and I'm going to manage those a little differently.
No, that's a great point. And that's what we often talk about, right? We're talking about diagnostic sampling where you're trying to treat a problem, or preventative or predictive where we're trying to use that tissue testing as a part of our nutrient management program. Cristie, do you have anything else to add? Something we might have missed?
I think Alan and Mike covered it pretty good.
Perfect. Next question. Can we increase protein on wheat when we're already applying 150 pounds of nitrogen for that crop? And this one's going to start with Alan.
So the short answer is yes, but there are a number of caveats to that. The whole equation of wheat yield, protein, and nitrogen is a complex situation. So basically, we have to recognize that the crop will try to meet the nitrogen, the needs for grain production first. So the nitrogen it takes up will go first towards grain production, and then nitrogen taken up in excess of what's needed to satisfy the yield for a given environment, that goes to boost protein. Now, timing also certainly plays a role in that, but there's been a number of studies demonstrating that we can apply nitrogen late in the season, even post-anthesis, and get a protein bump, provided we apply it in a way that gets it into the root zone to be taken up by the crop. And again, at that point, the yield potential has pretty well been determined, so nitrogen applied late goes primarily into protein. So again, it's an equation of yield potential in the given environment, and the balance between that yield and protein will determine whether or not we can get a response to additional nitrogen. If my yield potential is only 40 or 50 bushels and I put on 150, no, I'm probably not going to get an additional response. But if I'm growing 100 bushel yield of wheat and I've only put on 150 pounds of N, I am probably deficient, and yes, I would likely see a protein response to that additional application in season.
No,
so there's a lot that goes into that decision on the environment. We actually have a number of articles on the eKonomics website that go into greater detail on that you can look up and read.
Perfect, Alan. I appreciate that. Cristie, did you want to provide maybe a little bit of perspective from the Southern Plains and your experience there?
Yeah, of course. And I completely agree with Alan that if you're not applying enough nitrogen to meet your yield goal that you have, then there is some space for you to be able to increase protein content with nitrogen applications. But my main comment is to make our viewers aware of a potential interaction with other nutrients, like say sulfur. So we can increase protein content with the addition of sulfur applications, because high protein grains or high protein crops, there is an interaction there where you have to have enough sulfur to have a certain ratio between nitrogen and sulfur within the protein itself. And so, and like Alan said, you know, some of these later season applications, quite a bit of work coming out of Oklahoma State trying to increase protein content with those late season applications. And, you know, it could depend on the source that you're using. Use a readily available nitrogen source like UAN. It may depend on the droplet size. So look at, you know, the tips that you're using with those anthesis or post-flowering applications that may increase the efficiency of them.
No, that's a great point. And I'm glad both of you mentioned sort of that later season application, just from some previous experience, which I suspect we've all had with some of those later season applications of nitrogen containing products is, and Cristie, I'm glad you hit on it, is droplet size does matter and rate does matter as well, because the last thing you want to do is burn a flag leaf, right? That's the primary leaf that's going to be contributing a lot of photosynthate for that grain. And there's a lot of different technologies that exist out there in that space. I'm thinking about streamer bars, streamer nozzles, that you're not going to get as good of a foliar cover, but it can certainly decrease your burn potential from those applications. So just be very cognizant of rate. That's the other thing I'd make sure that I would stress on that. So since you brought it up, I'm going to go completely off topic now. I knew I would do this at some point, and since you brought it up, we're going to do it. Should we be actively supplementing more crops with sulfur? And I'm going to start this one with Cristie. Since she brought it up, it's fair game. She opened the door. So
yes. Do you want me to?
I would prefer that you would expand upon that a little bit.
So we're all aware of the Clean Air Act from the 1980s, where we're cleaning the atmosphere. We're having less sulfur deposition from acid rain. We're seeing more and more sulfur deficiency year after year in fields. So yes, we need to be aware of the fact that sulfur is becoming a limiting nutrient, and a lot of times sulfur deficiency kind of looks like nitrogen deficiency. And I'll go off topic too, and I'll go ahead and go with Liebig's law. And, you know, it's a common misconception that if I keep applying enough nitrogen, I can increase my protein content. Well, maybe not necessarily if your sulfur's limiting, you know. So I would say to our viewers that I'm going to use the term balanced nutrition and say that crops have a certain amount of each nutrient that they need. And if you don't supply all of them, then your yield could potentially be limited. So yes, sulfur application is needed.
So since Cristie has a little bit more of a footprint in the Midwest, is there any research coming out from any land-grant universities that are supporting the concept of an increased need for sulfur supplementation?
Yes, actually quite a bit. I know specifically here in Kansas, there's been a lot of work with the nitrogen and sulfur interaction in soybeans. You know, high yielding soybeans may need additional nitrogen above, maybe not early on, but maybe within the season to push those yields. And, you know, can we get by with an in-season nitrogen and sulfur application to boost the protein content in soybeans? That's a big thing.
Thank you, Cristie. Alan, anything from more of the Western perspective?
Yeah, you know, it's a little different picture in the West because we haven't had this big change that has occurred in the eastern half of the country. We haven't had historically a lot of sulfur deposition, atmospheric deposition anyway. Our soils are low in organic matter, so they're low in sulfur supply naturally. So in the West, in most of our areas, sulfur application has been very common over the years. So we're accustomed in the West to applying sulfur. We have high value crops. A lot of them have high sulfur requirements, like our potatoes and sugar beets and onions and a lot of alfalfa being grown as well. So we're growing crops that have high sulfur requirements with soils that don't supply a lot of sulfur naturally, and we don't have the atmospheric deposition. So this is really a new thing for us, like it is for some corn and soybean growers in the Midwest, where in these high organic matter soils, they've historically not applied sulfur, but now we're seeing deficiency virtually everywhere, very widespread because of the large reduction in atmospheric deposition. I wanted to add something on the protein thing that I think I should mention, and it ties into the first question about tissue testing. There are some good guidelines on flag leaf sampling for nitrogen, and that is a pretty good indicator of whether or not you'll get a protein response to these late season nitrogen applications in protein. So there's been a number of studies out of Idaho and Montana discussing the use of flag leaf nitrogen analysis for that decision making on late season nitrogen. So you might look into that a bit more.
Perfect. Thank you, Alan. Mike, how about the Southeast and sulfur?
Yeah, the Southeast definitely needs the sulfur applications. In previous employment, I used to work with the Extension Service and made a lot of fertility recommendations, looking at soil tests for a bunch of different crops. I think the first thing we started noticing on this was in forages, probably because we're removing so much tissue during the growing season and hay production, but we would growers would keep putting more nitrogen and not get a response. So we finally figured out what was going on. We're not getting that sulfur into the plants, so we had to start making sulfur applications, and we've seen a big improvement in that. Another thing I wanted to point out about sulfur is it acts a lot like nitrogen in terms of loss potential. We can leach a lot of sulfur out of the soil, especially in the Southeast in these deep sandy soils. So we need to manage how we apply that sulfur, make sure we're getting it out there in a timely manner when the crops can actually take it up. So.
Perfect. And interesting enough, from one of the individuals on the call, they pointed out there's a Reuters article out there right now that's talking about greater need for sulfur supplementation for agricultural production in North America. So sort of a timely question. And I apologize for going completely off topic and off what we'd agreed to, but I felt that Cristie had opened it up, so I went ahead and took the opportunity to ask the question.
Well, and if I could make another comment, that it also depends on the crop too. I mean, there's been a lot of research conducted that shows some crops do respond better. And shout out to a lot of Canadian farmers with canola production. They've been on top of sulfur for years, and they know the crops needed it. U.S., on the other hand, we're slow coming to the table, but we're getting there.
So this next one's going to be for Cristie again. We'll start with her. And this is, I struggled with this question because we want to try to keep this as short as we can. And I know that they could spend a lot of time talking about this, but what is the most important piece of information on a soil test report and why? So Cristie, you've got the first stab.
Yes. Awesome. So mine is pH. Every time I walk into a farmer's field, it's what's your pH? If he says, oh, I don't know, I'm like, you just better just go take a soil sample. And the reason is you could have all the nutrients in the world out there, but if your pH could be just a little bit off, a little bit low, or a little bit high, you could be experiencing some significant yield limiting nutrient deficiencies. And pH, okay, what soil test is maybe a couple of dollars. Just know what your soil pH is, then fix it, because that could save you a lot of money in the long run with fertilizer applications. Say your phosphorus levels are coming back and yeah, they're perfect. They're above that critical level. You're potentially gonna, you're potentially got enough in the soil to grow the yield that you want to. But if your pH is low or high, that phosphorus may not be plant available, or it may not show up in your soil tests, depending on what type of situation you're in.
All right, so Alan.
I like pH also. If I have one test I can take, that's the first one I'm going to do. And I guess to kind of put it in more of a general sense, pH just affects so many different processes in the soil. It affects our soil biology. We're all talking about soil health and the importance of biological activity, and those organisms are very sensitive to pH. So if we're too acid, too alkaline, it affects them. pH affects nutrient availability. Each nutrient is affected a little bit differently. And so we want to try to be at kind of that optimum, which most people feel is something in the slightly acid range, about 6.5. If you're growing, it's a little bit different for different crops. If you're growing potatoes, maybe you want a little more acid. If you're growing legumes, maybe a little closer to neutrality. But somewhere between 6 and 7 is usually considered kind of the optimum range. But there are so many things that are affected by pH, and so it's such a good indicator of potential problems. If your pH is very high or very low, it can indicate problems, and we've especially had to wrestle with this recently in the West with the acidification of soils really across the West. And I see Russ Miner is on the call today, and he's experienced that up in Montana with some really severe acid soil problems in some of our wheat producing areas that we just haven't experienced a lot in the West, and we don't often have a lot of good lime sources. So that's something we've been wrestling with. pH is really a big factor in productivity of our crops and the nutrients that we deal with.
Mike, do you make this a pH clean sweep, or are you going to point to something else?
Absolutely not. I'm going to argue with my colleagues and point out the fact that soil sample has numerous categories on there. We're looking at CEC, we're looking at nitrogen, we're looking at all of our nutrients that we need out there. And we've got to keep in mind that all of these are working together to provide plant nutrition. No one thing on that soil report is going to give us the answer we need. There's no one silver bullet. We have to look at all of these in combination. Now, having said that, if I had to look at one piece on that soil report, pH is the first thing I'm going to look at and want to get that pH balance first. But for the sake of argument, I'm going to point out that it's all equally important.
I like it. I like it when you're a little combative. That's entertaining. Next question, and I feel like I'm picking on Cristie at this point, but she's going to get the first stab at it, because this does play different regionally. So the question is around manganese. How do you get more manganese in the plant? And this is coming back. All their tissue samples keep coming back deficient. What's their best method of application?
I'll be the first to throw this out there and say it depends.
Oh, there it was. That's the scientific cop-out statement.
But it depends. But so the top 3 things that I would like to comment on for manganese would be, the first one's pH, even though we just had that conversation. Depending on what your pH is, that manganese may not be available, may not be plant available. Depending on what region you're in, and granted, guys, step in if I, step on any toes or don't say this correctly, but manganese can be lost in sandy soils. So if you do apply manganese and it's not there and it's not plant available, maybe you're in a situation where it's lost from the environment. The other thing would be what form you're using. So they're known to be manganese sources of fertilizer that are more plant available. So say the manganese sulfate, readily plant available, especially if you're trying to make in-season applications, would be more likely to be taken up by the plant early on. And nope, those were my 3. Those are the potential reasons on why you could be potentially applying manganese and not see any plant uptake.
Alan? Actually, I'm going to go with Mike first because I keep going in the same order. I'm going to go to Mike first.
Now, I agree with Cristie. We've got to make sure that it's available, and pH is one factor that's going to tie that manganese up. we've talked about pH. I feel like we're beating this to death, but we've got to get that pH right. And if that's not right, that's probably the leading cause of manganese not being available to the plants. The next thing is in the right place. With a lot of these micronutrients, they're going out at such low rates that we need to make sure that we're putting them out in a way that the roots can get to them. There's several ways to do that. An ammoniated fertilizer that's got all the nutrients in one granule provides for better uniform distribution. So that may be one option to make sure it's evenly distributed in the field and those roots can pick those nutrients up.
Alan, you get the last word on this one.
Yeah, so the way the question was worded leads me to believe that in this particular case, the soil is probably deficient and or they're dealing with, again, a pH issue, but where they're saying all the tissue samples are deficient, that leads me to believe that they have a real soil deficiency. So if that is truly the case, and you could identify that by soil sampling, then it would suggest to me that maybe they need some build-up type applications to the soil, and that may be higher rates. It may be broadcast to enrich the entire soil. But then we come to, okay, if I can't apply as much as I really need to the soil, what can I do maybe in the short term while I'm trying to build that soil up? What can I do in the short term to keep that crop from becoming deficient? And I think about a couple of practices that might be useful and can maybe get around some of the pH issues. And one is banding. Starter bands are a very effective way to apply manganese. You can use a lower per acre rate and still get high concentration in the root zone. Mike talked about having it where it's needed, and great way to apply micronutrients and get them where they're needed in the root zone very early in the crop when that root system is still small. So that would be one of the first practices I might implement. Then if it truly is related to soil pH, say my pH is too high and the manganese availability is just low, foliar applications may be the best way to get that into the crop. It may mean you have to apply several times during the season, but foliar sprays are much more effective at supplying micronutrients in high pH soils than applying high rates to the soil. So the combination of again, banding near the row, starters, things like that, and in-season foliar applications would probably be my short-term course of action while I'm trying to build up that soil test to where it really should be.
Perfect. You guys hit it so well, but I'm going to add just one thing because Alan hit on it, and it's from our experience in Ohio. We have a number of fields of soybeans specifically where we see some manganese deficiency, and it tends to be in our drier summer environments. We get a little bit dry, manganese gets in that oxide form in the soil, and it's not necessarily terribly plant available. And foliar applications can be beneficial, but what we typically see is we make the application, yes, we see a green up, we lose some of that interveinal chlorosis, but as we start to see that next leaf trifoliate emerge, you start seeing the same symptomology. So Alan, to your point, that's perfect. Generally, when you're talking a foliar application, specifically of manganese, it generally doesn't solve the problem. It's just sort of a stopgap solution to get us through for this cropping season. So perfect answer to that one.
But is that green up due to an increase in iron uptake depending on what manganese source you use?
Now, for us, now that may be a little bit different as you move west, but for those of us in the east, I wouldn't suspect that it would be an iron issue because that's one of Cristie's backgrounds is chelating technology, and she always wants to harp on us about not all chelates have the same affinity for metals.
Not all equal.
This next one's going to be a tougher question, but I'm going to pose it anyway because it was one that was asked, and I'm interested to know what the answer is. I know what the answer I've provided in the past. I don't know if it's right. This is going to go to Alan. What is the proper way to soil sample strip-tilled fields?
Yeah, thanks, Robert.
You're welcome.
This is a tough question, and I don't know that there's one good answer. There are different ways that have been proposed. I think probably the method that I've liked the best was some work done by Newell Kitchen. He was a graduate student at Colorado State, I believe, when he did this work, and they were looking at methods for sampling banded fields where immobile nutrients had been banded. Now, again, for nitrogen, this is probably not as critical, but it's because it's more mobile. But for P and K and the micronutrients, it is important. So if we're continually banding in a strip till or some other means, we develop these concentrated areas, and just random sampling may not give us a true picture. If we get too many samples from the band, we artificially get a bias to sample to a higher value. If we miss those bands, then we bias it towards a lower value. So I don't think there's really a good answer, but this method that was proposed was, if you know where the bands are, and in a strip till, you should know that, you would take some proportion of samples from the band versus samples outside of the band, so that you're balancing those two together. Now, the ratio that was proposed for corn on 30-inch rows was 1 core from the band to about 15 from between the bands. And that would give you approximately the right ratio. Now, if your row spacing, band spacing is narrower, that ratio would go down. And if you get to wheat, say on 6-inch rows, maybe a random sample is as good as the other because you have a higher percentage of getting in those bands. But this is a problem as we go to banded fertilizer, and strip till especially is becoming more popular. And I don't think there's a good answer to this question, other than some of the techniques that I've mentioned have been proposed. That it's not something we really have, I think, a concrete answer for.
No, I appreciate that. Anybody else want to chime in on this one?
Yeah, my biggest comment is maybe not necessarily on where you take the sample, but the sample depth. So if you're strip tilling fertilizer directly underneath the plant, the issue is hitting that band. Or if you're running a 2x2, potentially hitting that band of fertilizer that you're applying with your planter. But if you're strip tilling and you're able to apply it 6 to 8 inches deep, if you think about where that fertilizer is applied, and over time, if you strip till year after year after year, that fertilizer is expanding. And believe it or not, sometimes it expands, it can come up higher. So if you're taking a 6-inch sample, but you're shooting for an 8-inch fertilizer depth, you need to consider, am I hitting that band? But yeah, I agree. I completely agree with Alan. There's constant studies still going on, but there's no best option for sampling.
One other thing to add, another technique that I've seen proposed is you actually take a board and create a template, and you drill holes, I think it was 2 inches apart along the length of that board, which is your row width. So if you're on 30-inch rows, you make that board 30 inches long, and you put your soil probe in each one of those holes so that you're sampling across the entire width of the row, and that regulates your proportion of in-band to outside the band, and you maintain, you have samples close to the band and then samples further from the band. And that may work well in a research setting, but I want to make a comment about that kind of thing. If that is so laborious that it leads the farmer to say, that's too hard, I'm just not going to do it. Well, it may be a good technique, but if it's too difficult for the farmer to do, and it's something that's going to cause him to sample less, then that's going the wrong direction. So a random sample would probably be better than not sampling at all. I'm not sure about that, but that statement could come back to bite me.
That's why you love these panels, when you get asked these hard questions. Cristie, do you have something to add?
Well, I was just anybody who does strip till, and if you don't feel like you're getting the right, the right soil test levels back, when in doubt, apply a starter fertilizer. That can ensure that you've got at least some nutrients close to the plant early on and help it until it reaches, say, those stroke till bands. That's my
Yeah,
tidbit.
Cristie, that's a really good point, and something I don't know that I always bring out in my own education programs, but these farmers that are transitioning into strip till, you should have had a good idea of what your fertility level was going in, and you should have an idea of what your nutrient applications are, however long you've been doing strip till. If something's coming back as like way too high or way too low, that probably, I wouldn't guess it'd be too low, to be honest with you. Most likely you're probably going to be influenced by it being way too high, because nutrients don't change all that dramatically over the span of the immobile ones that we're talking about today, primarily phosphorus and potassium. They're not going to change all that dramatically. So yeah, if you notice that your soil test levels are through the roof now, it's probably because you're oversampling the bands. That's a great point, Cristie.
Mike, you want to comment on Robert's comment that he just made about potassium not being mobile in the soil?
Good grief. You're going to hammer me with sands. All of a sudden, you're going to start talking about coastal plain soils in the southeast and how sandy they are. And
he brought up CEC on the soil test. I'm just saying.
Yeah, that's the world we live in down here. We have guys that are actually making repeated applications because they're leaching it away. So,
man, I can't even say potassium is immobile anymore, can I? I have to say it depends. Man, you guys make life so hard. All right, so perfect. We've got Mike on the screen. He's going to be the next one to answer the question. We have high iron levels in the soil, but our tissue samples in our corn continually are marginal at best. Any comments as to why? I feel like we've already touched this, but.
Yeah, I've got a couple of comments. The first thing is we're going back to pH again, but iron works a little differently than most of our other micronutrients. Iron actually likes the pH to be at lower levels. It's more available at the lower levels. If we get that pH up too high, iron is less available. Another possibility is this iron could be tied up in the soil. If we get an excess of phosphorus, excess zinc, manganese, molybdenum, nickel, the zinc can actually get tied up with each of these other elements and not be available to the plant. It doesn't matter how much is actually in the soil. If it gets tied up, it's not going to be able to be moved into that plant. And then another situation is it just may not be in the right place. So we've already talked about micronutrients and how we need to make sure that those are placed correctly. So that's my ideas on this, what may be going on. I'm sure others may have some different ideas.
Alan or Cristie?
Yeah, we know soils are rich in iron. There are many iron minerals in the soil. They're largely in iron oxides that are not very soluble. They're not plant available. And the total content of iron may be 4, 5, 6% or more. Highly weathered soils like down in the southeast where Mike is, the clays themselves are iron oxides, but that iron is not plant available. So when we do a soil test, we're typically using some kind of chelate extraction or weak acid extraction to pick up something that is an indicator of plant availability. But because there's so much iron in the soil, it may not give us a true reflection of what actually is available. And particularly in high pH soils, the soil test for iron is not particularly meaningful. And fertilizer applications to the soil are not particularly helpful. If you're at a pH of 7.5 to 8, putting more iron in the soil probably isn't going to do anything unless it's in one particular chelate, something known as EDDHA. And I think there's some new kind of versions of that that have become available, but a very narrow group of chelates that are stable at high pH. And so then you go to foliar applications, but really iron nutrition is generally not a problem in acid soils, as Mike said. In high pH soils, it's a problem, but it's very difficult to correct with fertilizer. So in most cases, if you have true iron deficiency, it's probably because of high pH.
Perfect. Cristie, have anything to add?
I think they both covered that pretty good.
Okay, next question. This is a very specific question, but I know it's one that we're getting more interest in, and individuals asking these questions. When is the best time to apply boron to corn? And I'm going to go throw that one to Alan.
For the micronutrients, I like to have them present from the beginning. Now for corn, one of the real critical periods for boron nutrition is the flowering period, tasseling and silking, because boron plays a role in pollination and the growth of the pollen tube down to the kernel. And so that's a critical stage, but I don't, in most cases, don't want to be trying to apply it at that point just to meet that demand. I like to get the micronutrients there in my pre-plant or my starter program so that they're there from day one. Boron is used for things besides flowering, so it really is needed throughout the season. I like to have it there early, but I certainly want to make sure it's there before pollination in corn.
Anybody else have maybe a different perspective on different crops?
Yeah, Robert. Boron was one of the nutrients when I was working with peanuts years ago. Every acre of peanuts, we would make a couple of applications of boron. So the main thing about a boron application is you can actually burn those crops pretty severely with boron. So we always made multiple applications. In corn, we could make that with our nitrogen applications, put it in the tank to go out then and not have to make an extra trip through the field. But just be careful applying this boron that you don't do crop damage with that. But like Alan said, we need to get it out early and make sure it's there before the crop goes into the reproductive stage. That's the main thing that I'm seeing with boron.
Cristie, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, just a comment on where people would potentially see boron deficiencies. Highly leached sandy soils, low organic matter soils, and dry soil conditions. Here in Southeast Kansas, Kansas State has done some research and, showing yield bumps in corn, soybeans, and wheat, maybe 5 or 10 bushel with applications. But I know we're beating a dead horse with the lime conversation, but you could correct your lime and have adequate P and K, and then you might even see a yield bump with boron applications.
Yeah, perfect. Mike, I'm glad you brought up the point about over application of boron. This is true for most of our micronutrient metals, right? There's a pretty fine line between sufficiency and toxicity. So the one caution that I always throw out there for folks interested in supplying specifically foliar applications of micronutrients is follow the label rates closely. Don't go off label, because you can end up severely cutting back yields. Next question. Now we're closing in on about 15 minutes. We'll try to get in another couple of questions here. Alan, I apologize. I keep going back to the well, but I'm coming back to you again. What is your opinion of the Ydrop application technology for nitrogen and sulfur in corn production?
Yeah, so I'll first make a general comment about why we might use this tool, and that is that we know in corn production in the Midwest, we have the potential for nitrogen loss, while split applications or side dressing haven't proven universally superior to pre-plant. We know there are situations, if we're certainly going to have nitrogen loss potential, then split applications are recommended. So we put this question in that context, and we look at this Ydrop machine. It's a tool to help facilitate those side dress applications. And I guess the advantage of the Ydrop system is it allows you to band that side dress nitrogen close to the row. So rather than just dribbling it between the rows, or maybe a broadcast spray, or even a dry broadcast that is going to sit on the surface. If you don't have moisture to get down to the roots, some of that might not become available when you want it to be there. The Ydrop allows you to put it right near the row. So that's the advantage of that tool. If there are other ways of achieving that, then certainly we would expect them to perform similarly. But like any tool, there are probably going to be places where maybe it doesn't fit so well, but the research in Illinois using the Ydrop application tends to look pretty favorable towards banding close to the row rather than midway between the rows. So if that's the tool that helps you do that, seems like a good tool. We've actually had some of those treatments in some of our other nitrogen studies with Dr. Fred Bilo, who's done a lot of work with that. But I wouldn't necessarily endorse that tool at the exclusion of others that would allow you to do a similar thing. So again, look at these things as a tool to achieve a specific objective, and to the extent that it will do that in your system with your equipment and the things you're trying to do, then I would say, yeah, it's a great tool. It has performed well in the research that I've seen.
Anybody else, Cristie?
All right, Alan hit the nail on the head. I mean, the biggest concerns that I've heard with it, and granted, yes, it could potentially be the most efficient way of delivering nitrogen and sulfur with in-season applications, but it is very costly. You have to have the equipment, high clearance sprayers to be able to get over the plant. But I agree, it may be the most efficient system for applying a liquid fertilizer that would be relatively plant available the day you apply it. But you do have to watch application rates, because putting in the fertilizer that close to the plant, you could still burn it. So.
Thank you for that. And it's interesting how far we've come, because I remember when I first started in extension way back in the early 2000s, I'm not trying to reveal my age at all, and I got questions of, do I have to put nitrogen on every 30-inch centers, or can I go to 60s? And Alan, I'm sure, remember some of the work that Bob Hafe did at Illinois. I think it was in the late 70s where he was testing, do I have to put it every 30, or can I get away with every 60? And here we are now talking about even more precise applications of fertilizer, basically banding it or dribbling it right near the row. Interesting how the technology has changed.
Yeah.
This is likely to be our last question, so I'm going to go a little bit off script, and I'm going to ask a question that's further down on our list, but I think it's a good one to close on, because it sort of wraps everything up. So, Mike, we're going to start with you, and that is, name something a farmer could do to improve the ROI of their nutrient applications. You only get to pick one thing, though.
Okay, well, since I get to go first, I guess I get to pick pH. We've talked about this several times today. I'll take the easy one. The pH is so critical, and I can't stress that enough. We've got to get these pH levels right. I've literally looked at thousands of soil reports over the last 20 years, and probably 90% of them, the pH is too low here in the Southeast. So what I used to tell growers, if you only have a certain amount of money to spend on your fertility program, get your pH right first. That's going to get you the most bang for your buck. It doesn't matter how much nutrients you're putting out there. If you don't have your pH right, you're not going to get the maximum out of it.
Perfect. I figured someone would take the easy pH. And I also expected it would be the first person. So, Alan, you get to pick something it's a little more buried, and then poor Cristie's going to have to dig deep to find an answer.
You know what? Since this is an ROI question, I'm gonna tune my answer into that, and that is, if you want to improve your ROI, the principles of economics show us that we should be fertilizing at the economic, where we get maximum economic yield, and that's not the maximum yield we can attain, but the yield that produces the greatest profit. So that's where the last dollar spent on the input earns us $1.01 on the return. So that's, basic principles of economics. That's near the top of the yield curve, but not quite at it. And if we're fertilizing near or at that maximum economic yield, that's where we're going to make the most profit with our nutrient applications. And tied into that, of course, is having everything in the proper balance. That means not just one nutrient at that maximum economic rate, but all the nutrients at that maximum economic rate.
Perfect.
that specifies that we're not applying excess. We're not spending money on nutrients that are not needed, that are beyond what the crop can use. So that it's critical to understand that that maximum economic yield does not mean we're applying excess. We're applying just what we can use.
And we could spend an hour on
Yes.
that point alone. But in the interest of time, because I was going to push back a little, I completely agree with you. But and this is a question that we often get, right? And I'm very aware of the time. The question we often get is, okay, what is the right rate? And obviously it does depend. But sometimes what the right economic decision depends upon is something you have no control over, you have no visibility on, and that is, what is the price of fertility going to look like in the future? And but I completely agree with your point, but I was trying to push back a little bit because I would love to have that dialogue just for the benefit of the audience to sort of hear, what do we think about the economics as more agronomists and scientists? What is our view of the economic realities of production agriculture? Because what we think is the right agronomic answer isn't always necessarily the right economic answer. And I think that's an important conversation to have, but in the interest of time, I'm going to stop. Cristie, you get the last word. And I feel like I know what you're going to say, but I'm going to let you say it anyway.
You know what? I'm going to surprise you. And I'm going to go with, I'm going to go with a shout out to our ROI calculator on the economics website. And I'm going to go with understanding spatial variability. So when you get a soil test back, and granted, I'll wrap it back in. But when you get a soil test back, farmers need to understand that it's an average. So if you're sampling on a 2.5 acre grid, then it's an average of that 2.5 acres. Well, if it's right near the critical level, so the critical level set by universities to say above this, we have a low probability of seeing a fertilizer response above this critical level. If your soil test levels are below that, then more than likely you may be leaving yield in the field. So my tidbit on ROI is maybe farmers could hedge their bets and increase and take more of a build to maintain approach and cover up that spatial variability by building up their soil test levels above critical. That way, it's an average. There's less likely to be areas within that field that fall below that where they might be limiting their yield.
Yeah, you went completely off of what I expected you to say.
Now, but I'll go there. But looking after, what Alan said on our next question on our list, Liebig's Law,
That's where I expected you to go. That's where I expected you to go, to be honest with you.
Making sure that you have all nutrients plant available and having balanced nutrition and applying more nitrogen to the plant will not necessarily increase your yield because it's going to be most limited by your most limiting factors.
Perfect. We've got 5 minutes. I think we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. Just to acknowledge, Ming, thank you for the questions and the comments. I saw that you'd taken down the one that was on, or someone had taken down the interaction between micronutrients, specifically manganese and herbicide tie-up. I actually had a PhD student that did some research on that back in the early 2000s. We could have spent a lot of time on that, but that may be a question that we can deal with in a future webinar. I hope everyone has enjoyed this session. Again, we're looking for your feedback. Let me thank the panelists. Thank you, Mike, Cristie, and Alan. It's a joy to work with you every day, and just appreciate the background and the expertise that you bring to the table. And I hope the audience enjoyed that as well. Be looking forward to our next webinar. We're not sure when the next one will be, but there certainly will be one in the future. Leave your comments, leave your suggestions, leave questions. We'll take those. Even if we don't answer them in a forum like this, we can certainly provide some level of response in an email or something that we might ultimately post something on our economics website. Keep going to the site. If you have any feedback that again, topics you'd like to see us discuss, feel free to reach out, provide that feedback to us, and we certainly take all of that under consideration. I appreciate everyone's attendance. I hope you have a good growing season and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care, everyone.